17. Black Soul and R&B legends who vanished without a trace. What if some of the greatest Black Soul and R&B voices didn't simply fade away, but were quietly erased? Their records kept spinning, their sound kept making money, yet their names disappeared from radio stages and history. Stay with us because these forgotten stories are darker than you think. Subscribe to Black Legends Revealed. Betty Davis. Betty Davis did not disappear because the music was weak. She disappeared because the music was too alive for the people selling it. In the early 1970s, funk was still learning how dangerous it could sound, and Betty walked in already fully formed leather sweat growl sex control and no apology. Her 1973 debut, Betty Davis, was followed by They Say I'm Different. In 1974 and Nasty Gal in 1975, records that placed a black woman at the center of desire instead of asking her to decorate somebody else's fantasy. She wrote, arranged, and produced with a force the industry usually allowed men to claim. That was the problem. Betty was not built to be softened. Radio could handle male funk stars bragging, sweating, and prowling across stages, but when a woman did it with her own band behind her and her own name on the work, suddenly the room got nervous. Her image began to eclipse her musicianship in the public conversation, and after Nasty Gal failed commercially, Island Records shelved her planned follow-up Is It Love or Desire, leaving the tapes untouched for more than 30 years. What happens when a black woman is not rejected for lacking talent, but punished for owning too much of it? After that, Betty stepped away. No long farewell tour, no public breakdown, no carefully staged comeback plea. She simply withdrew from the business that had proven it did not know how to carry a woman like her without trying to shrink her first. Decades later, reissues and documentaries helped a new generation hear what the 1970s had missed the blueprint for artists who would come after her. From Prince to Erykah Badu, to every woman who understood that freedom can sound frightening before history calls it genius. Betty Davis vanished from the spotlight, but not because the flame went out. The industry backed away from the heat. Sly Stone. Sly Stone once stood at the center of black music, like a man building the future in real time. With Sly and the Family Stone, he created records that sounded decades ahead of everybody else. Explosive bass lines, psychedelic soul, interracial unity, wild stage energy, and lyrics that mixed celebration with social tension. At Woodstock, crowds watched him command thousands like a preacher pulling electricity from the night itself. Songs like Everyday People and Family Affair did not just dominate radio. They reshaped the sound of modern funk, R&B, and hip-hop before those genres fully understood what they were becoming. Then, almost unbelievably, Sly Stone began disappearing while still alive. Concerts became unpredictable. Bandmates described missed rehearsals, isolation, paranoia, and increasing drug dependency as the once brilliant architect slowly drifted away from the spotlight he had created. Entire audiences sometimes waited for performances that never happened, because nobody knew whether Sly would even arrive. By the late 1970s and beyond, the disappearance felt emotional before it became physical. The man who once looked unavoidable suddenly became difficult to find, difficult to understand, and eventually almost ghost-like inside music culture itself. How does someone powerful enough to influence generations slowly fade until fans begin wondering where he even went? That mystery deepened over the years as stories emerged about financial problems, legal battles, health struggles, and periods where Sly reportedly lived in extremely modest conditions, far removed from the glamorous image people remembered. Younger artists sampled his music constantly, while the creator himself seemed detached from the empire built around his genius. Sly Stone simply drifted further and further out of public life until he became one of music's most painful disappearances, hiding in plain sight. Darondo. Darondo became one of soul music's strangest disappearances because most people never realized he existed until decades after he was already gone from the spotlight. In the early 1970s around Oakland, California, Darondo moved through the local music scene like a neighborhood legend, flashy clothes, luxury cars, women surrounding him. and a smooth falsetto voice that sounded heartbreakingly delicate against gritty street life. Then almost suddenly, he vanished from music almost entirely. The mystery deepened because Durando did not disappear after one catastrophic scandal or public collapse. He simply drifted away from recording while his music faded into obscurity. For years, people who remembered him described bizarre stories surrounding his lifestyle, rumors of hustling strange business ventures, local celebrity status, and an almost mythological Oakland presence that blurred the line between truth and legend. Meanwhile, the records themselves became rare collector treasures hidden inside crates and forgotten radio archives. How does someone talented enough to sound timeless disappear so completely that an entire generation grows up not even knowing his name? In the 2000s, younger music collectors and DJs rediscovered Didn't I, and suddenly the ghost returned. The song spread through documentaries, sampling culture indie playlists, and late-night internet discoveries, introducing audiences to a voice that sounded frozen in emotional amber. By then, Durando himself had already spent years outside mainstream music, working ordinary jobs and living far from the glamorous fantasy attached to soul legends. His story feels deeply unsettling because it proves how easily extraordinary black artists could slip through the cracks of the industry, leaving behind masterpieces while the world barely noticed they were gone at all. Billy Preston. Billy Preston was the kind of musician other legends trusted when the room needed saving. Before most people knew his name, he had already played with gospel greats, backed Ray Charles, and stepped into history with the Beatles, earning the nickname many fans still repeat the fifth Beatle. His electric piano on Get Back helped brighten one of rock's most tense final chapters. And his own hits, including Outta Space and Will It Go Round in Circles, proved he was not just a sideman. He was a star with enough fire to stand alone. But Billy's disappearance was not one clean fall. It was a slow pulling away from the center of the music world. Behind the grin, the keyboard brilliance, and the church-raised joy, he carried private wounds, addiction, legal trouble, and health problems that kept tightening around him. Later reporting and documentary coverage described his struggle to reconcile his sexuality with his faith, along with childhood trauma and substance abuse that followed him for years. By the 1990s, drug-related arrests, prison time, and public embarrassment had replaced the glow of the stages where he once seemed untouchable. How does a man play beside the Beatles and still end up disappearing from the rooms he helped make legendary? His final years became quieter, heavier, and harder on the body. Preston suffered from kidney disease, received a kidney transplant in 2002, and later fell into a coma after kidney failure in 2005. He died in 2006 at only 59. The tragedy is not that Billy Preston lacked greatness. The tragedy is that greatness kept calling his name while pain pulled him somewhere darker. He did not vanish because the music stopped loving him. He vanished because the industry knew how to use his light, but never learned how to protect the man carrying it. Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield was not a man the world expected to lose to silence. His voice had carried movements, not just melodies. With the impressions he gave Black America, people get ready and keep on pushing songs that sounded like prayer, protest, and survival wrapped into harmony. Then came his solo years, Superfly, and a sound that exposed street life without surrendering Black dignity. Curtis did not simply entertain people. He gave them language for struggle. Then on August 13, 1990, the stage became the thing that took him away. At an outdoor concert at Wingate Field in Brooklyn, sudden winds knocked over a lighting rig, sending it crashing down as Mayfield came on stage. The impact crushed his spine and left him paralyzed from the neck down. One moment he was preparing to sing in front of thousands. The next, the body that had carried one of soul music's gentlest revolutionary voices would never move the same way again. How does a man disappear from the spotlight when his mind is still burning, but his body has been taken from him? Curtis did not vanish because his music lost power. He vanished because the accident made public life almost impossible. Interviews became rare. Touring was gone. Even recording required a new kind of pain. For his final studio album, New World Order, released in 1996, He recorded vocals while lying on his back, sometimes singing one line at a time because that was how he could control his breath. He later received Grammy honors, but diabetes complications forced the amputation of his right leg in 1998, and he died in 1999 at 57. Curtis Mayfield's disappearance was not empty absence. It was a soul legend surviving in rooms the spotlight could no longer reach, still pushing upward even when the stage had been stolen from beneath him. Merry Clayton. Merry Clayton delivered one of the most unforgettable vocals in rock and soul history, then somehow seemed to vanish from mainstream conversation almost immediately afterward. In 1969, late at night, and reportedly still wearing curlers, Clayton was called into a Los Angeles studio to record backing vocals for the Rolling Stones. What happened next became legendary. Her explosive voice on Gimme Shelter sounded less like background singing and more like a warning siren tearing through the song itself. When she screamed rape murder, it's just a shot away, the recording captured something terrifyingly real. Even Mick Jagger later admitted the performance transformed the entire track. Yet, despite creating one of the most recognizable vocal moments in modern music, Merry Clayton slowly disappeared from the center of popular culture. She continued working recorded solo material, sang with major artists, and remained respected inside the industry, but the spotlight moved elsewhere. That disappearance became even more painful because tragedy followed close behind the session that made her immortal. Pregnant at the time, Clayton later suffered a miscarriage shortly after recording Gimme Shelter, a heartbreaking detail that deepened the myth surrounding the performance for decades. How does a woman deliver one of the greatest vocal moments ever recorded and still become almost invisible to the wider public afterward? That question hangs over Merry Clayton's legacy like unfinished music. Unlike stars who vanished through scandal or public collapse, her disappearance felt quieter and somehow sadder. The industry remembered the song more loudly than the woman behind the scream. Years later, documentaries and interviews finally reintroduced audiences to the voice hidden inside one of rock's darkest masterpieces, reminding people that a black woman had helped create a cultural landmark while history largely pushed her to the background. David Ruffin. David Ruffin did not disappear all at once. He disappeared while the world was still applauding him. At his peak with the Temptations, Ruffin looked unstoppable, sharp suits, towering confidence, and a voice so emotionally violent it could turn heartbreak into theater. Women screamed when he walked on stage, but behind the elegance, something darker was already growing: ego, paranoia, addiction, and a desperate obsession with becoming bigger than the group itself. The collapse became brutal. Ruffin reportedly began missing rehearsals, arriving late to performances, and demanding special treatment that pushed the other Temptations to their limit. Then came the moment many fans still see as the beginning of his destruction. He allegedly demanded the group be renamed David Ruffin, and the Temptations, believing the audience only cared about him anyway. Motown refused. The group turned against him. By 1968, one of the greatest voices in soul music had been thrown out of the empire he helped build. But the truly shocking part came afterward. Ruffin reportedly began showing up to Temptations concerts uninvited, sometimes jumping on stage unexpectedly, grabbing microphones and trying to reclaim the spotlight in front of confused audiences. Can you imagine becoming so addicted to fame that you haunt the stage you already lost? That haunting feeling followed David Ruffin for the rest of his life. Cocaine addiction intensified. Financial problems mounted. Arrests, instability, and emotional collapse slowly replaced the glamorous image fans remembered from television screens. By the late 1980s, the man who once symbolized Motown perfection looked exhausted, isolated, and consumed by the very fame he once controlled effortlessly. Then came the horrifying ending. In 1991, Ruffin died from a drug overdose after collapsing in Philadelphia, reportedly left for hours in a limousine before receiving medical help. He was only 50 years old. The tragedy still feels unreal because they are not remembering an ordinary singer disappearing. They are remembering a king who slowly vanished while still hearing the crowd scream his name. Gloria Scott. Gloria Scott did not vanish because nobody heard her. She vanished because the people who heard her never built the road she deserved to walk on. In 1974, Barry White was one of the hottest forces in soul music, and when he produced What Am I Gonna Do, Gloria seemed positioned for a real arrival. Her voice had polish ache and adult tenderness, the kind of sound that could sit beside Love Unlimited, glide across black radio, and still cut straight through heartbreak. But the timing was cruel. Casablanca Records was still young. Barry White had his own empire pulling at him, and Gloria became trapped inside a machine that had too many projects and not enough protection for hers. Just As Long As We're Together gave her a charting moment. But a moment is not the same as a career. The album needed radio muscle touring support television visibility, and a second push. Instead, it drifted. A second album was recorded with arranger H.B. Barnum, but it never came out. How does a singer disappear when the music was already good enough to save her? That question follows Gloria Scott like a ghost note. She did not self-destruct in public. She did not become a scandal. She did not lose the voice. She lost momentum in the quietest way possible through delayed plans, missed promotion, unreleased tapes, and an industry that moved on before the audience even knew what it had missed. Decades later, collectors and soul lovers found What Am I Gonna Do Again and treated it like buried treasure. But by then, Gloria's first chance had already been stolen by silence. Her disappearance was not an accident on stage. It was a slow fade engineered by neglect. Jimmy Ruffin. Jimmy Ruffin spent much of his career living inside one of the cruelest situations in soul music, being extraordinary while standing in the shadow of someone even louder. His younger brother David Ruffin exploded into superstardom with the Temptations, while Jimmy carved out a quieter but deeply emotional lane through songs like What Becomes of the Broken-Hearted. That record did not sound like ordinary heartbreak. It sounded like abandonment, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion bleeding directly into the microphone. Audiences connected instantly because Jimmy sang pain like a man who already knew too much about disappearing. But the shocking part of Jimmy Ruffin's story is how completely the industry slowly let him fade from the spotlight despite the power of his voice. Motown pushed bigger personalities harder. Trends changed. Fame shifted toward flashier stars, while Jimmy drifted further into the background, even after creating one of the most devastating soul songs of the 1960s. Then came the darker emotional weight surrounding his family itself. As David Ruffin spiraled publicly through addiction arrests, instability, and eventual overdose, Jimmy watched his own brother collapse in front of the entire music world. What happens to a man already fighting invisibility when tragedy inside his own family becomes bigger than his career? That sadness quietly followed Jimmy Ruffin for decades. He continued recording, touring, and even found renewed success in Europe during the 1980s. But in America, his name slowly stopped appearing beside the giants he once stood with. By the time Jimmy died in 2014 at age 78, many younger listeners had no idea how deeply his voice shaped soul music history. He simply became one more legendary black artist whose emotional brilliance slowly faded behind louder stories, louder scandals, and louder stars. Tammy Terrell. Tammy Terrell's disappearance did not begin with silence. It began with applause. By 1967, she and Marvin Gaye had become one of Motown's most radiant pairings, their voices wrapping around each other on Ain't No Mountain High Enough and Your Precious Love with a warmth that made America believe in young love again. Tammy was only in her 20s, but she carried the poise of someone built for a long career. Bright smile, gospel-rooted phrasing, and a voice that could sound innocent one second and wounded the next. Then, on October 14, 1967, during a performance with Marvin Gaye at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, her body gave way. She collapsed into Gaye's arms on stage. What first looked like exhaustion soon became something far more terrifying. Doctors diagnosed a malignant brain tumor. Surgery followed, then another, and another. Reports say she endured 8 unsuccessful operations before her death in 1970, at only 24 years old. How does a star vanish when the audience is still waiting for the next song? That is the ache in Tammy's story. She did not fade because fans stopped loving her. She did not disappear because Motown had no use for her voice. She was pulled out of the spotlight by illness, while her records were still alive on radio. As her health declined, she retired from live performance. Even later recordings became surrounded by debate over how much she was physically able to sing. When she died on March 16, 1970, Marvin Gaye was shattered, and many writers have connected her loss to the grief that later deepened his music. Tammy Terrell left no long farewell, no final tour, no closing speech. One moment she was singing beside Marvin. The next, Motown had a hole where her future should have been. Brenda Holloway. Brenda Holloway had the kind of voice Motown executives dreamed about. Emotional, elegant, vulnerable, and strong enough to cut through radio speakers instantly. In the 1960s, songs like Every Little Bit Hurts made her sound devastatingly human, the kind of singer who could turn loneliness into something almost cinematic. Berry Gordy saw enormous potential in her. Smokey Robinson worked with her. Even the industry understood she belonged among Motown's biggest female stars. Then, almost without warning, she vanished from the machine while still young enough to keep climbing. The disappearance shocked people because it was not caused by one giant scandal or public breakdown. It came from emotional exhaustion pressure and a growing feeling that fame itself was swallowing her identity. Brenda later spoke openly about the psychological strain surrounding Motown's relentless system, the pressure to constantly perform, travel, compete, and maintain an image while privately struggling emotionally. At the exact moment, many artists would have sacrificed everything for more fame. Holloway walked away from the spotlight almost completely during the early 1970s. Can you imagine turning your back on stardom while the entire industry is still trying to make you famous? That decision transformed Brenda Holloway into one of soul music's most haunting disappearances. The mystery only deepened because Holloway had all the ingredients of a superstar, beauty, vocal power, major label support, and respected collaborators. But emotionally, the cost became too heavy. Her story feels deeply unsettling because it challenges the entire fantasy of fame. Brenda Holloway did not disappear because success rejected her. She disappeared because she rejected the emotional damage she believed success was beginning to create inside her own life, leaving behind one of Motown's most beautiful unfinished stories. Jean Terrell. Jean Terrell stepped into one of the most impossible positions in Motown history. In January 1970, after Diana Ross gave her farewell performance with the Supremes at the Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas, Jean was introduced as the new lead voice beside Mary Wilson and Cindy Birdsong. The world did not hear her as Jean first. It heard her as the woman replacing Diana, and that shadow was already waiting before she sang a note. Still, she delivered. Up the ladder to the roof. Stoned Love, Nathan Jones, and Floyd Joy proved the Supremes could survive after Ross. But survival was not the same as freedom. Motown was changing. Diana Ross's solo career was becoming the priority, and Jean's era was constantly measured against a past no living singer could recreate. Every headline carried comparison. Every interview dragged the group backward. Even when the records worked, the narrative did not fully belong to her. Behind the glamour, the owl. Terrell and Linda Lawrence reportedly grew frustrated with Motown's lack of promotion for that lineup, and because Motown owned the Supremes' name, walking away meant leaving the brand behind. How do you disappear while still singing inside one of the most famous groups in the world? That is the quiet cruelty in Jean Terrell's chapter. She did not vanish because her voice failed. She vanished because the spotlight kept searching for someone who had already left. In 1973, Jean departed the Supremes, and history slowly folded her years into a footnote beneath Diana's legend. No scandal was needed. No public collapse had to happen. Comparison did the erasing. Jean Terrell helped carry Motown's most famous female group through a dangerous transition, then watched the culture remember the shadow more loudly than the woman who stood inside it. Barbara Randolph. Barbara Randolph's silence feels painful because she was never standing outside the dream. She was already inside the room. Born in Detroit, raised close to entertainment and connected to actress Lillian Randolph, Barbara had the kind of presence Motown usually knew how to polish into gold. In 1967, she appeared in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, then stepped into Motown's world with I Got a Feeling, a Holland Dozier Holland record carrying the same factory brilliance that had powered so many stars before her. On paper, everything looked ready: the voice, the look, the timing, the label, the songwriters. But Motown was not just a family. It was a hierarchy. Some artists were built into monuments. Others were kept close enough to be useful, but never close enough to become untouchable. Barbara was reportedly considered as a possible replacement for Florence Ballard in the Supremes before Cindy Birdsong took the role. Later, after Tammy Terrell's health declined, Barbara toured with Marvin Gaye. Think about that for a moment: close to the Supremes, close to Marvin, close to the center of black music history, yet somehow still kept at the edge of the photograph. How does a woman stand beside legends and still disappear before the world learns her name? That is the ache in Barbara Randolph's story. She did not vanish because of scandal, laziness, or lack of talent. She vanished through hesitation, label priorities, missed timing, and a system crowded with gifted black women fighting for limited light. Motown gave her openings, but never a full doorway. Barbara Randolph became one of those names soul lovers rediscover later and wonder how the industry let her slip away. The answer is cruelly simple. Sometimes erasure does not happen because someone is pushed out. Sometimes it happens because no one powerful enough ever pulls them all the way in. Al Green. Al Green did not vanish because the world stopped wanting his voice. In 1974, he was one of the most seductive forces in soul music. The man behind Let's Stay Together, tired of being alone and love and happiness. His sound was velvet and fire at the same time, intimate enough for a bedroom, holy enough for a church pew. Then on October 18, 1974, violence entered his Memphis home and split his life in two. The incident became one of soul music's darkest turning points. Mary Woodson, a woman romantically involved with Green, poured scalding grits on him, causing serious burns, then died by suicide with his gun. History describes the attack as the event that pushed Green toward a deep religious reckoning. The man who had been selling desire to millions suddenly began asking what his life was costing his spirit. How does a singer keep performing love songs after one night turns love, guilt, pain, and survival into the same wound? By 1976, Green had become an ordained pastor and purchased Full Gospel Tabernacle Church in Memphis. The shift stunned fans. He did not simply change his sound, he moved the center of his life away from pop stardom. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, he increasingly devoted himself to gospel ministry and the pulpit while his presence in secular R&B faded. Al Green was not erased by a label, swallowed by a bad contract, or forgotten because the hits dried up. He stepped away from the world that had made him a sex symbol because the price suddenly felt unbearable. The voice remained. The soul remained. But after that night in Memphis, the man who once made romance sound effortless began searching for salvation where the spotlight could no longer follow. Joe Tex. Joe Tex once looked impossible to ignore. Loud, funny, emotional, unpredictable, he brought a different kind of energy into soul music during the 1960s and 1970s. While many singers stood still behind microphones, Joe Tex talked, danced, joked, preached, and practically acted out entire arguments inside his songs. Hits like Hold What You've Got and I Gotcha made him a major force in R&B. But behind the charisma sat a career constantly surrounded by tension, feuds, and emotional instability that slowly pushed him away from the spotlight. One of the darkest parts of Joe Tex's story was his bitter rivalry with James Brown. The hatred between the two became legendary inside soul music circles. Reports described years of insults, mockery, jealousy, and public humiliation, with Tex openly taunting Brown both on stage and in recordings. At one point, after one of Brown's personal tragedies, Joe Tex reportedly appeared wearing a hairstyle mocking him publicly, escalating the hostility even further. Fame, paranoia, emotional exhaustion, and constant competition were beginning to consume him. What happens when an entertainer spends so much energy battling rivals that he slowly disappears from himself? That disappearance became painfully real during the later years of Joe Tex's life. After converting to Islam and stepping away from music for periods of time, he drifted further from the center of mainstream soul culture while younger stars took over the industry he once dominated. By the time he died suddenly from a heart attack in 1982 at only 47 years old, much of the public conversation had already moved elsewhere. The sadness remains obvious. Joe Tex helped shape the sound and personality of black music, yet his legacy often feels buried beneath louder names, old rivalries, and a career that slowly slipped out of public view before many people realized he was disappearing at all. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway sounded like a man carrying both heaven and exhaustion inside the same voice. His music did not simply entertain people. It reached into grief, loneliness, faith, and emotional survival with terrifying honesty. Songs like "A Song for You Someday," "We'll All Be Free," and his unforgettable duets with Roberta Flack made listeners feel as though Hathaway understood pain too deeply to fake it. By the 1970s, many believed he was one of the greatest soul musicians alive. Then the darkness consuming him privately became impossible to separate from the music itself. The shocking truth behind Donny Hathaway's disappearance was mental illness at a time when almost nobody in the industry understood how to handle it properly. Hathaway battled severe paranoid schizophrenia and depression for years while trying to continue recording and performing under enormous pressure. Friends and collaborators later described terrifying episodes where he believed people were trying to harm him or poison him. During recording sessions, his behavior could suddenly shift from brilliance to fear and emotional collapse within moments. At times, he reportedly stopped taking prescribed medication because of the side effects, causing the instability to intensify further. What happens when one of the most beautiful voices in soul music becomes trapped inside a mind constantly at war with itself? That war eventually turned tragic. In January 1979, while working again with Roberta Flack on new music in New York, Hathaway suffered another severe mental health episode. Hours later, he fell from the window of a hotel room at the Essex House Hotel in Manhattan and died at only 33 years old. The image still haunts older soul audiences because Hathaway did not fade through scandal, ego, or irrelevance. He vanished while still carrying extraordinary musical gifts the world barely had time to fully understand. Donny Hathaway's disappearance remains one of soul music's most heartbreaking losses, not simply because a legend died young, but because the pain inside him was already audible long before the silence arrived. Howard Tate. Howard Tate vanished so completely that even the people who helped make him sound immortal thought he might be dead. In the late 1960s, his voice cut through soul radio with a strange, pleading fire sharp enough to hurt, warm enough to heal. With producer Jerry Ragavoy, he recorded "Ain't Nobody Home, Look at Granny Run Run, Stop and Get It While You Can," the last of which became even more famous after Janis Joplin recorded it. He had the voice, the songs, and the critical respect. What he never received was the long protection a talent like his deserved. Then the lights around him slowly went out. His 1972 Atlantic album failed commercially, and after a few more attempts, Tate slipped out of the music business by the late 1970s. The silence that followed was not clean or romantic. In the 1980s, after his 13-year-old daughter died in a house fire, he fell into drug addiction and eventually lived in a homeless shelter. Ragavoy searched for him and reportedly believed he had died. How does a soul singer become so lost that even his own producer cannot find him? That is where Howard Tate's disappearance becomes almost ghost-like. His records kept circulating among soul collectors, while the man himself was counseling addicts, preaching and living far from the career that had once seemed ready to lift him. Then in 2001, he was finally found, and the comeback felt less like publicity than resurrection. His 2003 album, Rediscovered, reunited him with Ragavoy and earned a Grammy nomination for Best Contemporary Blues Album. Tate died in 2011 at 72 after complications related to multiple myeloma and leukemia. His story does not sound like a normal fade-out. It sounds like a voice swallowed by grief poverty. And time then pulled back from the dark just long enough for the world to realize what it had lost. They didn't just vanish, some were erased while their voices were still making other people money. The stages moved on. The labels stayed rich. The songs kept playing. But the Black artists who built those moments were left behind in locked rooms, hospital beds, empty apartments, and forgotten contracts. Was it addiction illness? And bad timing? Or did the industry quietly decide certain legends were easier to profit from than protect? Which name on this list was robbed the worst? Drop your answer in the comments and follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for the stories they tried to bury.